Welcome. I'm Lucia Lee. I'm an educator and creative writer.
And I'm JT Neal. I'm an organizer, writer, poli-sci nerd, and just a general geek.
This episode, we are talking about DEI in terms of training, workshops, and initiatives here in Baltimore City. As a guest to talk about their own experiences and stories, we have Rosa, an educator, a dogma.
Hello.
And we have Grant, also an educator and a teaching artist.
Hello, how are you?
Of course, we know it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's just this umbrella term that has been used in professional spaces to address issues of culture and discrimination and racism. I'm just cutting in here to say that this is actually part 2 of a POC on DEI. This is a little bit of part 1 and then a continuation of that discussion in part 2. So we'll do a little bit of the previous conversation and then we'll get right into what we talked about in the second half.
And I think in a lot of ways for educators, being able to say, well, I participate in DEI conversations gives them the excuse to write off some of their other behaviors. I was substituting a class on Friday and I hear through the wall clear as day, "Shut your damn mouth." And it's this white woman yelling at her majority POC class. And I hear this through the wall. And this is someone in a place of authority who's in charge of our National Honor Society junior whatever version. And it makes sense why that club space is a particularly white club space. There's these things where she gets to feel good about herself, but also doesn't recognize how that toxicity in a classroom is in no way helpful for the student, regardless of whether or not they're frustrating the heck out of you. I think we can all say we've all had a kid that has frustrated us past our last rope. You're just through the roof. But I could never imagine cussing at a kid and making them feel that low. If I've ever made a scholar feel that low, you best bet I've held them back and talked with them and apologized because I've clearly let my own issues pour out onto them. I've publicly apologized because I'm human and I make mistakes, but just hearing that and knowing that there was no end to that, I heard her kick that kid out of her classroom. And I don't have a lot of power over it. I can't walk into that woman's classroom and say, that's not an appropriate way to interact with your students at all. If you need a moment to step out, take that moment. You should not be teaching. You shouldn't be talking to a kid like that.
I think at that moment, there's no control over even yourself. How are you going to regain any kind of calmness in your space, in your classroom space?
And that's a celebrated educator who's been teaching for 15 plus years. Those are supposed to be your mentors.
It's deeper than, the students feeling like they fit in or they belong. It's do I feel safe? We've all had students who have talked to us in a way that you might not appreciate. Me personally, I tell my students, I don't talk to you like this, so you don't get to talk to me like that, and I won't talk to you like this, and you won't talk to me like that. But there's other ways to handle these things, and the student is not going to feel safe in that environment. And unfortunately, learning doesn't happen in an environment where a student can't feel safe. That is the foundation of the education. Yeah. We can't have people just assuming that the students will absorb this information before we allow them to even feel safe. Because anxiety literally prevents you from being able to do anything, really, especially at such a young age before you're able to develop that emotional balance and emotional self-regulation. So we really are just doing these students a disservice more than anything. And it is really unfortunate. And I'm really sorry that you had to experience. Another thing is that we've all experienced these educators who just cannot seem to manage their own emotions.
Yeah. That's so crazy because that's the first day of trauma-informed care training. They're not going to learn if they're not feeling safe. A lot of the buildings that I've been in, they don't have proper heating. They don't have AC. Obviously, you can't drink any of that tap water. This is all part of basic bodily needs. So how are you here talking about diversity and equity and we're all in our coats learning algebra,
Yeah. Or you get an email from your staff saying, hey, remind the kids that because of the humidity, the floors are sweating. Be careful in the hallways. We've all lost 2 pounds of weight from sweating through the humidity in your poorly insulated building.
If you could be the absolute dictator of your schools or your school systems, How would you structure your DEI training? What initiatives would you be like, this is what's got to be in it?
I feel like there needs to be a separation between like the purposes of the training. There's training, of course, to educate around the history and the current lived effects of these policies. I think that definitely needs to be occurring. There are people who these are their first conversations ever with these topics. But I do think there needs to be a separate place where we're actually planning and implementing changes to our individual school places. Like there has to be a way for teacher voice to actually have a part in changing what our school needs, because it ends up being like an admin decision. We have these conversations and then the majority of the staff is then done with that conversation. They're done with whatever steps are going to be taken to address that conversation. And I think that no, that shouldn't be the case. There needs to be an opportunity for teachers to actively be involved in the decision making. Like, here are policies that we'd like the administration to consider based off of issues that we have been able to identify as a staff and with our scholars, with scholar input, and that those two separate spaces need to be occurring simultaneously in order for this to move forward.
What about you, Grant?
I definitely think that there needs to be a separation. And the people who are being affected by the intergenerational and current trauma should not be the people who have to go through with these educational training, because that in itself can be a trigger. You know, I had a coworker who I was talking to. We were just talking about the infrastructure issues of Baltimore City Public Schools. Everyone knows about the lead issue with Baltimore City Public Schools. It's been a problem. I was just talking to her about that, and her response was, I don't actually know what lead is. And in my mind, I'm just like, how can you be working in Baltimore City and like not actually even know what lead is? I understand how it's helpful to that person to have this conversation with me, but how is it helpful to me to have this conversation with this person? So there definitely should be like a way to guide the discussion in a way where if you're more familiar with these issues, then you don't have to keep talking about the same things. And
It is the same thing every year, though. It literally.
And another thing is that it's the same thing every year.
It's a stagnant thing. Like, there's no expectation or way to grow if it's the same discussion and the same information year to year.
I'm just like, to be honest, I'm processing this like, because, I'm in Nashville, and Metro Nashville Public Schools has a lot of issues, but they're different. They're coming from a different direction, right? I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. It's barely a city. It's just a small town in the state that people don't really care that much about unless you're going to a bachelorette party. It's very interesting to see how different it is just from y'all's experience. Because, like, for example, in Nashville, if the water to the school is interrupted in any way, the school cannot operate. So they have to send the kids home. There has to
Technically,
be...
that's the policy.
Yeah, but like it's something where it's like they take it very seriously. Like, I remember being a student in public school, and like it was like, oh, did you hear about Stratton or whatever? I don't think they ever did have any plumbing issues, but it's like if there was anything, it was like they got to go home early. There's a wide spectrum of experiences across the board, or at least in two different places, two different cities of a similar size, because I think Nashville and Baltimore are close size-wise, but Nashville is technically integrated with the county. There's no separation. They are one thing. But yeah, I'm just sort of processing, because this is very illuminating for me.
I think definitely another thing I would like to see would be less of a black and white kind of perspective. And I think as a Black person who has really spent my entire life educating myself about these issues, there are things that we can learn from other cultures. We unfortunately are leaving a major blind spot. And I would definitely like to see more emphasis on how can we get through to our Latino students, or how can we get through to our queer students, or how can we get through to our students who might use ASL or anything like that. We have to learn how to work with all of our students. It is definitely important that we cultivate that Black joy and cultivate that sense of belonging for our Black students, but we also have to remember that solidarity doesn't just come out of nowhere. You have to create that, and you have to build that, and that That's a process. We have to start that process early.
So I think I kind of understand what you're saying. There's kind of an absence of curiosity that I also find happens just kind of very comfortable staying in a bubble. You know what I mean? I guess for me right now, what it seems like is like DEI as a concept is just supposed to encompass so many things like race and disability and gender identity and sexuality just is supposed to fix everything. And I feel like that's kind of been the idea with education too. It's just like supposed to fix everything. I just don't think that any of these initiatives have any teeth to them. Once the discussions happen, there aren't any mechanisms in the initiative that actually create policy change. The only mechanism I know of is literally just survey after survey after survey. And I have filled out surveys, but I have not been seeing any results.
No, I know that feeling. To be honest, it kind of sounds like corporate America, because I know
Yeah, it is.
I realize I probably shouldn't say the name, but at a very large multinational corporation I worked for, they gave us a survey for all their employees, and every year, everyone would complain about the same thing, which was for us at the time, tools. And every year, all of these managers, our direct managers, would get in trouble because we complained about anything at all. And so, when you have a good manager who's like helpful and, does a good job helping you do your job, and then they get in trouble because you were like, hey, if we're actually being serious about changes, can we change this one thing? It was very disheartening. And it made it very difficult to sort of trust in, the management of the company, right? And it really just sort of depressed everyone to see that. So I can only imagine being being the administrator of a school and having these processes, having these trainings, and just having surveys at the end. How can you not see the looks in your teacher? How can you not catch the vibe of these people are very dissatisfied with all of this?
It's not that the vibes aren't being caught, it's that the vibes are being caught and then put away and then nothing is done.
Yeah,
like they're well aware the vibes are there. They know there's bad vibes. They're just trying to brush it under.
Most of the time too, the people leading those discussions and trainings aren't the actual admin. It's been advocated to someone else. It's now the equity team chair. It's this so-and-so at-risk teacher. It's not actually admin because they're busy putting out the fires that their policies keep going, that they don't even have the time to address these and actually think about these issues. I know that quite a few of my admin are really hardworking and want to bring about change, but literally spent all of Friday with angry parents because their kids got suspended for inciting fights and things like that. This limitation in the sense of it's triage. We're doing triage on a surgery-ready concern.
Right. And that's kind of the problem, JT, when you were saying like, oh, in your area, they take AC and like the condition of building code very seriously. But it's like, that is also triage for us. Like if all the buildings are so old and so many of them don't have AC, it's not going to be a matter of like go in and gut all 20 of these schools. It's literally just, let's give them fans.
Yeah. And trust me, it is not perfect around here. To see it as a higher priority with more action, I think, is very interesting to observe.
I also wonder if just redirecting the initiatives to target admin and admin support might be more effective if that is the level at which a lot of these decisions are being made, with suspensions at least.
Yeah, because I hadn't thought about that before, but a lot of the data points that are captured for and about students, a good chunk of them are literally things that a principal or somebody in the administration of an actual school decide. So having your teachers be like, oh, look at how many X number of these kinds of students are being suspended or having these disciplinary issues. And it's like, well, I don't technically discipline them. You do. So why are you telling me about it? Shouldn't you be doing something about it? What are you doing about it? Why are we having this conversation? You need to have this conversation. That is not something I had really considered before.
Part of the conversation is also what is in your locus of control. We have all been in a conversation in DEI around what do you have control over? And we all tend to come to the same conclusion, very little. That's what ends up happening. We all tend to identify these big issues and we can talk about the steps we can take, but ultimately I don't set the school schedule that makes it really hard for parents to get their kids there at 9 in the morning because the school district decided to push their middle school starts back. Those things are not things I can control. I think there are two conversations happening, an admin level one and then a teacher level one, because I can reflect on how I'm contributing to the problems. Maybe there is an unconscious or unidentified bias that is maybe resulting in this is how I handle a situation. And I think that reflection is absolutely crucial because a good teacher is a teacher that's constantly reflecting and learning. But also, a good 60% of the time, I don't have control over these things. I don't. My school's district has the control over them. Not even my at school level admin have that control. Because we have an issue with attendance and we're a district that buses kids. We actually have buses. While Baltimore City says, here's a voucher, use the unreliable city buses, which is something New York does too. But our school district provides buses, but the buses are not internalized. So we have bus drivers who literally will come one day and tell our admin, we're not taking the kids. We're not going to take them. And the admin, my vice principal goes on the bus to try to convince a bus driver that's not even employed by our school because we've outsourced this labor because it's cheaper that way, as opposed to having dedicated drivers who are capable of working with children. And we've got grown adults who are like, it's your fault that your thing dropped and people were looking for it. And you should get a write-up for this. Like a kid was in tears because their AirPod dropped and their bus driver got mad at them for trying to find it. That's how a kid starts their day. My admin doesn't have control over that, but our school district does because we could be in-housing this labor, but we're going with the cheaper route because what is a living wage in the school system? Doesn't exist because it is an underfunded, underappreciated, de-emphasized part of our overall federal spending. We as a nation have said peace out to education being a priority. And that has just trickled it down to everyone else.
Period.
It is. It very much is. But the conversation
Absolutely.
is always about only it being a conversation in the schools.
Yeah.
Okay, but why aren't all of our lawmakers going through this type of training? Because ultimately they pass the funding on the state level that allows the redlining of Baltimore City Public Schools to have even existed to the extent that these buildings can become trash. But then what is our federal education system doing when there's legitimately states in the Midwest where all of their school districts are so broke that they're living through their jacked up buildings like we are in Baltimore?
Yeah.
But it's the entire state because there's no federal oversight. So there's an enormity of this problem. And I don't want to ignore that. It's a huge, huge, huge problem. Education is one of those core tenets to our values as a United States American, is this idea that education is supposed to be open and free to all, that everyone is deserving of a quality education. But we're still having these legitimate constitutional questions that are going Supreme Court level is what is a deserving education? Why are students having to sue states? States then challenge these rulings to the Supreme Court level about what is education.
Yeah.
It's because we've made education this political debate as opposed to this is actually what creates healthy citizens as opposed to workers that can then be exploited and these wealth disparities continue to increase. Like, it's huge problems.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we can't get bogged down with that stress. We acknowledge what we have power over, and we also say, now that you're giving us these tools, how are we actually changing it? We can't be, as you said, in that standstill. DEI has been a nice entryway to looking at what does reform of our education systems look like, but it can't be the place we stop. And the
Right.
reason that we're seeing such pushback is because there's legitimate fear to that challenge of power and that seat of control, which is why you see politicization of like what books should be evolved in classrooms and things like that, as opposed to, no, you should be confident in your children being able to make the best decisions in pursuing their education. Like, ultimately, our job is to give students the tools to access an entire world and navigate it. And that's scary when you just need a working class.
Yeah,
Bear, stop
absolutely.
it. Bear's upset by this too.
Oh,
She's a whiny.
Bear. Well, I think this is a good point to wrap up our conversation. Rosa and Grant, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, so just thanks to all the listeners, and don't forget, we're out here out of love, right? So let us know what's bothering you, Baltimore. Maybe we can address it next time.
Send us an email at whats.wrong.bmore@gmail.com or DM us in our socials. We have our Instagram at whats. But thanks for joining us. We will catch you next time.